This is the Great Vocal Majority Podcast. Hey everybody, it's Tony Contasmati with the Great Vocal Majority Podcast, and this is volume 56. That is entitled Repeal the Second Amendment? All Americans who care about the Bill of Rights, and especially the Second Amendment, should write retired Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens and thank him for reminding us all of the danger that's posed by leftists like him to our most basic and cherished rights. Now, Stevens penned an opinion piece in the New York Times calling for the repeal of the Second Amendment. Does anything argue more loudly for the appointment of conservative justices to the Supreme Court more or better than a former justice who, if he were still on the court, would favor the repeal of any part of the Bill of Rights? If you weren't convinced previously of the clear and present danger posed by leftists against the preservation, protection, and defense of the Constitution, what more evidence is needed at this point? Seriously. Justice Stevens, who's now 97 years old, is still smarting from the 2008 Heller decision that declared the right of gun ownership to be an individual right. Stevens doesn't bother in his opinion piece to make much of a counter-argument against the Heller decision, except to note the fact that it was something of a departure from Chief Justice Warren Burger's well-documented hostility to the Second Amendment, where he articulated it in an interview in 1991.
If I were writing the Bill of Rights now, there wouldn't be any such thing as the Second Amendment.
Which says?
That a well-regulated militia being necessary for the defense of the state, the people's rights to bear arms. This has been the subject of one of the greatest pieces of fraud, I repeat the word fraud, on the American public by special interest groups that I have ever seen in my lifetime. Now just look at those words. There are only 3 lines to that amendment. A well-regulated militia. If the militia, which was going to be the state army, was going to be well-regulated, why shouldn't 16 and 17 and 18 or any other age persons be regulated in the use of arms the way an automobile is regulated?
Calling for the repeal of any of the amendments in the Bill of Rights exposes all of them to the same act and could easily lead to precisely the sort of tyrannical government the framers feared. Now, here is something to consider. From the ratification of the Constitution in 1787 and the Bill of Rights until the National Firearms Act in 1934, neither the Congress, the President, nor the courts saw any need to enact any kind of limitation on the ownership of firearms. In other words, for the first 147 years of this constitutional republic, there wasn't a single law on the books limiting firearms ownership. Think about that. The right to keep and bear arms has been controversialized, and it's only been controversialized over the past 84 years or so, with increasingly radical calls for constitutional change, and Justice Stevens is one such radical. What occurred to initiate such federal laws such as the National Firearms Act? I mean, how did it come about? Why did the federal government consider it to be necessary to limit firearms ownership back in 1934? The answer is one that will not make leftist progressives happy, because it's an indictment against their policies. You see, the events precipitating the National Firearms Act was the organized criminal violence arising out of the demand for alcoholic beverages and spirits, which were banned by the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act in a thing called prohibition. Progressive politicians, in their very misguided judgment, in my opinion, arrogantly believed that they could solve the social ill of alcoholism and all its attending negative side effects by banning the sale and importation of beer, wine, and spirits. Their naivete proved to be deadly dangerous because their fundamental belief that they knew best how others should live their lives was met with scorn, it was met with repudiation, and it was often met with rebellion. The sheer stupidity of the progressive-led efforts to prohibit the consumption of alcoholic beverages by constitutional amendment criminalized both its sale and distribution as well. Trafficking in this contraband was profitable, but it was also risky. Still, it was a risk that criminals would take. And the ensuing bloodbath over territories between criminal groups and law enforcement cried out for something to stop the violence. FDR's election in 1932 brought an end to prohibition, but it also brought with it calls to limit the automatic weapons the bootleggers were using. In other words, the progressive era of prohibition led to another progressive era called gun control. Had there been no prohibition, it's really difficult to imagine why there would have been any demand for the National Firearms Act. The National Firearms Act is the typical way progressives address problems when their ideas fail and result in a greater social catastrophe. Faced with failed plans, liberal left progressives simply employ new plans. It never occurs to them that their premise that society can be centrally planned is what is really in error here. For to admit that would mean the end of liberal left progressives' dreams altogether. So what we've had since the 1934 Firearms Act is a growing full frontal assault on the right to keep and bear arms.
And what we need to do is change the way in which people think about guns, especially young people. One thing that I think is clear with young people and with adults as well is that we just have to be repetitive about this. It's not enough to simply have a catchy ad on a Monday and then only do it every Monday. We need to do this every day of the week and just really brainwash people into thinking about guns in a vastly different way.
The argument made by the liberal left progressive is that the Second Amendment was drafted at a time when firearms were single-shot muskets and pistols. They think they are reasoning logically when they say that the framers are really only intended for those kind of weapons. And since they're limited in their capabilities, that should be the only kind of weapons that are owned by civilians. It's really a ridiculous argument because it assumes the framers were unaware of firearms innovations at the time they were writing the Second Amendment. But also, as so many arguments made by leftists do, it conveniently ignores the fact that the single-shot muskets were also the prevailing state-of-the-art in firearms at that time. It could just as easily be argued by gun rights advocates that the framers intended for citizens to have the right to keep and bear the state-of-the-art in firearms. Would they prefer that? Here's the bottom line. The United States has a long history and tradition of firearms ownership by civilians. It is based in our sacred and inalienable right to self-determination, individual sovereignty, self-defense, and private property. It is wholly antithetical to those founding principles for any American, much less a retired Supreme Court justice, to suggest its repeal. That is a betrayal of our Declaration, our Constitutional, and especially a betrayal of his oath when he took office as a Supreme Court justice. It reveals a disturbing lack of commitment to their oath of office, and it serves as a reminder of how critical it is that our courts are populated with judges and justices who both understand and respect why every amendment in the Bill of Rights represents an inalienable right that government cannot eliminate through repeal. For even if the Second Amendment were to be successfully repealed, people would continue to understand innately that they have the God-given right to protect themselves, their families, and their possessions from physical threat or theft, whether by another individual, a group, or a tyrannical government. Such repeal would almost certainly result, as all leftist progressives initiatives do, in a societal dysfunction that was worse than what they were trying to solve in the first place, which would be bloody and profoundly regrettable. Once Americans recognize that the enemy of liberty isn't the Second Amendment or the NRA, but the leftist liberal progressive vision of a centrally planned and controlled society, they will reject and repudiate that vision in favor of individual liberty. For the great vocal majority, I'm Tony Codispoti. Thanks for listening. You can subscribe to these podcasts on iTunes, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, or through my website, greatvocalmajority.com. Thanks for listening.